The money to do the plan.
Yeah,
Agreed.
you know, it's a catch 22.
Yep.
What's the word? Well, again, we're. All right, so
All right.
we're back to work sessioning. And next is greenhouse gas emissions inventory results. Community development intern, Megan. Hi, Megan. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. So today I'm going to be presenting our MATSUB 2022 emissions inventory and kind of what they mean and what they can be used for looking forward. So I created a story map presentation and I'm going to talk through it today, but it can also be used on the website as a source of information. So a quick introduction on an emissions inventory. It's a comprehensive list of data that outlines by source the amount of air pollutants that are released into the atmosphere by a certain jurisdiction or a company within a certain time period. Usually it's 1 year. And greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide or methane are major contributors to climate change by trapping heat in the atmosphere with what is known as the greenhouse effect. And in emissions inventory, to kind of compile the different impacts of different air pollutants, it is often given in CO2 equivalents because that is the most abundant greenhouse gas.
One sec. The link for this presentation is on the bottom of that memo,
Cool, sweet.
just so everybody can follow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so why does Mount Crested Butte need one? We are in the process of creating a climate action plan and a sustainability plan for the town. And this will include goals to help reduce the emissions that are contributing to climate change. Doing an initial emissions inventory will help serve as a baseline to help track the changes in emissions going forward. And as it also will serve as a resource to see what opportunities might exist to help reduce emissions from certain sources. And for our emissions inventory, we use the year 2022. So a quick overview of Mount Crested Butte. In 2022, the population was 954. As we know, there's a lot of tourist activity because of CBMR that occurs up here, which is present in both the housing and the transportation, people driving up here. There are a lot of short-term rentals, which lead to a high vacancy rate. In 2022, there were 668 short-term rentals, and that number is increasing. And in comparison, there were 79 deed restricted units, which kind of shows you the breakdown of what kind of housing is primarily up here. For the town boundary, which I included a map up here, it includes the CBMR base area, but the lifts and everything else operate on US Forest Service land, so that is not included in our emissions. And looking at our methodology, how we conducted this emissions inventory. A major part of emissions is the different scopes. So scope 1 will be all the activities that are occurring within the boundary of Mount CB, and this will include stationary fuel combustion, so people burning natural gas or propane in their property or in boundary transportation, so all the cars driving up here. Scope 2 will be our grid supplied energy, and ours comes from GCEA and all the energy that is used within the buildings up here. For scope 3, this is all of the activities that occur outside of the town, but do impact what happens inside the town. So included in our emissions inventory will be the waste that is generated in Mount CB, but is disposed of outside of the city in the Montrose or Gunnison landfills. Another part of scope 3 emissions is the out of boundary transportation, so induced travel from people flying or driving in to get to Mount Crested Butte, but these emissions are not included in our emissions inventory. And in gathering data, we reached out to our utility providers to get their energy usage data. From GCEA, we got the electricity usage, and from Atmos Energy, we got the natural gas usage in the different units corresponding to those energy sources. For our solid waste, we got this data from Waste Management, and this came in the tons of waste that was generated by Mount CB that was sent to the other landfills. For water and wastewater, there is a wastewater treatment plant here, and so that will comprise of the emissions from the processes used to treat the water at the treatment plant, and the electricity from that plant is accounted for in the electricity emissions. For transportation, there were kind of a few aspects. So one of the main aspects was vehicle miles traveled by single occupancy vehicles. And while we couldn't get direct data from exactly how much driving was occurring within the town boundary, we were able to get vehicle miles traveled or VMT data for the entire Gunnison County. And to do our best estimate of how much this was actually in Mount Crested Butte, we used a per capita per day VMT and then allotted that to the population of Mount Crested Butte. And for our public transit, we measured that 1.4 miles of each round trip that the RTA takes occurs within the boundary of Mount Crested Butte. So we got their total VMT data and then just allotted 1.4 miles of each trip in Mount Crested Butte to get the emissions of just it operating in Mount Crested Butte. And for the Mountain Express, there are certain routes that occur either partially or only in Mount Crested Butte, as you can see kind of on the map here. And they gave us their vehicle miles traveled divided into each of their different routes. So we were able to pick out the routes that operated only in Mount Crested Butte or what proportion of those other routes were operating in the town. And to get from our usage data or the VMT from different transportation sources, we used a greenhouse gas accounting software, ClearPath, to help calculate our emissions, in which we put in the energy usage in the given units or vehicle miles traveled for specific types of vehicles, and they calculate the emissions through that program. And this software can also later be used in planning to help reduce our emissions that are contributing to climate change. And now looking at our results, here is a graph that separates out by source the different emissions. As you can see, a majority of our emissions are coming from residential energy and commercial energy, whereas transportation and solid waste comprise just under 20% of our emissions. And in our case, the emissions generated from the processes of the wastewater treatment plant were pretty negligible in comparison to the other emissions. So a really important part of emissions inventories is kind of comparing different years to see where you've been and where the trend is going. So we were comparing our 2022 emissions inventory to a previous 2019 emissions inventory, and we found that there was a decrease in essentially every category of emissions, as well as a 9% decrease of total emissions. So what do these changes mean? Right here, I have outlined just the numbers of metric tons of CO2 equivalents, and you can see that there's just around a 4,000 ton decrease of emissions from 2019 to 2022. And the town of Mount Crested Butte has not really taken any specific actions to help reduce our emissions, but there are a few things that this trend can be attributed to. One of those is the increase of renewables in our electricity grid from GCEA and Tri-State. And this means that even if energy use stays the same or increases, the emissions from it will decrease because there's more renewables in the grid. Another factor that contributed to this decrease in emissions was that 2022 was a significantly warmer year than 2019, so less energy was used for heating residential and commercial buildings. And looking forward, so although the 2022 town's emissions haven't significantly increased from 2019, the town still must implement climate actions to reduce these emissions that are contributing to climate change. Energy consumption, as I said, comprises 83% of our total emissions, and this is really where the town has the most ability to control the emissions by either reducing consumption of electricity and energy or advocating for more renewables from our utility providers. And here I've outlined 3 major sustainability challenges for the town moving forward. The first one of those is going to be our existing buildings and housing. So addressing existing buildings and housing will look like decreasing energy use, and this can help lower costs for the residents or people paying these bills, and it can also reduce the emissions from climate change. And the second major challenge is our climate risk preparedness and resilience. So this really looks like community planning to help reduce vulnerabilities against climate events or disaster. For example, the wildfire risk increasing, having plans in place for when and if that were to happen within the town or affecting the town's business. And the third major challenge is sustainable businesses and tourism. As we know, we are in a ski community, which is dependent on snow, which is being impacted by climate change. And so really prioritizing sustainability in a ski community is really important. And additionally, providing information for both residents and tourists can help them educate themselves, and especially the tourists can maybe take some of these ideas home with them to continue to spread sustainable ideas. So I have 2 main recommendations for the town moving forward. One of those is to create a specific emissions reduction goal like many other towns or states have already done. And this can kind of happen in 2 ways. One of which can be a percent reduction, which could look like a 50% emissions reduction by 2030. And another way, it could be a quantity reduction. So this could look like 20,000 tons of CO2 equivalents reduced by 2030. And this will really just help us track our progress as well as aligning ourselves with other state or federal goals to reduce emissions. Another major recommendation is to focus on equity and affordability, as any climate action we take needs to be able to be accessible and lower costs for both our residents and tourists. And this would look like, again, reducing energy use by implementing more electricity efficiency measures or installing something like rooftop solar to help reduce those costs as well as our emissions. Thank you for your time. Are there any questions?
Questions? Great report, thank you.
Yes. I just, one, of all the gases in the atmosphere, what percentage is CO2?
Where geographically, where are you talking about, Antarctica?
No, just, just what is the composition of our atmosphere?
Isn't there
And what
reason-
percentage of it is CO2?
Isn't there a region, can you jump to the next question you're trying to get to? You're leading us to the next one.
I'm trying to get to.
I'm not-
I wanna know.
But isn't that different? It's not a global concentration that's consistent about every piece of land and water, it's
Well,
different.
then the average.
Okay, I can kind of answer that. So when we started really dialing in climate change policy and seeing the impacts of climate change in the early 2000s, the threshold that we were never supposed to cross was 400 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. We've already passed that. I think we're at like 492 parts per million. I don't know what
Okay,
percent of the atmosphere.
400,
400.
1 million, so that would be,
492 is what it said.
so 492 parts per million.
400.
490,
Yeah, 400 was the threshold we were never supposed to cross.
and we're at 492 now? Okay, so we've already blown through that. But so the
Some impacts
percentage,
of
that
climate change
would
are
be
irreversible. at this point,
somewhere
yes.
around 0.04%.
0.04%, yes.
That's good.
Okay, well, I was using 400, not 492.
Yeah,
Okay. And the reason I'm curious about that is that less than 1% of, I'm trying to wrap my head around how much impact are we really gonna be able to make? And so, from my perspective, if we're going to, drop it from 0.0492% to 0.04%, what difference is that gonna make?
If everybody
So-
does it though, it adds up.
I actually think-
That's, I granted, I understand that, I just wanna know, why do we think that we're actually going to be able to accomplish squat?
So when you say we, do you mean me as in the world or we as in Mount Crested Butte?
Well,
Okay, so my answer to why Mount Crested Butte should pursue, I think this is really loud. You should pursue climate action on any scale, even though, I put in the memo, comparison of our emissions to other similar ski towns in similar years, just for reference. And so, yeah, the sum total of our carbon emissions are a drop in the bucket globally. If we cut all of our emissions in Madison County to zero tomorrow, would it make a huge difference? No. But I think that there's three kind of big ways that climate action can really impact our community. Number one, as Megan alluded to a lot, is that it impacts quality of life, and that's in affordability. So if we have if we're using less energy, no matter what that energy is, it's a lower cost to each individual. And so part of equity is looking at our cost of energy, and if we reduce the amount of energy we're using, we're reducing the cost to people. So quality of life for energy and then air quality. There's not really a downside to improving our air quality by reducing vehicle miles traveled, by using e-bikes, or by reducing the amount of coal or wood fireplaces or whatever, climate actions. And then the third thing that Megan also kind of alluded to is that we are a town of less than 1,000 people, but our visitor base is huge. And so if we can have just even a marginal impact on people visiting from Texas who have never recycled before, who have never seen an e-bike, I think that we can have an outsized impact. So,
and I respect that, I appreciate that. I'm still curious about what is the net result going to be in temperature.
I think as
I think that's a question that nobody's answered.
Yeah, and I think it's probably bigger scope than what, it's a fair question. I'm not discounting it, but I think it's maybe outside of what we're talking about tonight. Not the least of which no offense to anyone here, but I don't think we have people here who can answer those questions for you precisely.
Well, my concern is that you're talking about, well, it's gonna cost people less. Well, does it really? When the measures that we're using to, that we're, putting in play cost more. Does it cost less when things cost more?
Well, so I'll answer that and then we can kind of change directions, but.
And I don't want to wade into this. I'm just.
Well, and so
I'm
that's
just
not,
really
I think what you're honing in on is probably a conversation that we're gonna have
The
surrounding.
quality of life question. How much does it cost people to implement all this and what's the benefit?
So,
What's the cost benefit
Well, that's to be
analysis
But
that
what we're having,
justifies everything that we're wanting to do? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I just want to see the numbers.
Totally.
and what we have here tonight is a report. It's not digging into specific policy actions, some recommendations have been made, but this is a report tonight, and so what we do with this report and what actions we take, if any, will be subject of future discussions.
I'm concerned that when we are wading into, establishing policies, that we really take a hard look
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
what the unexamined consequences are.
Seems like.
Well, this
we're
is-
good at that.
This is an
I'll just drop it.
This
Yeah,
is an
leave it at
information
that.
piece.
I just think that, there's we need to know more before we just willy-nilly start making policies,
Make sure.
hoping.
Fair enough, and again, we're not making any policies tonight, so.
Also, nothing
I know.
about this seems willy-nilly, I
Right.
will also say for the record.
Janet, please.
The recommendations that you have here in the report, I think are overly optimistic considering it's only 6 years away.
Yeah, that wasn't my specific, like, that
That was an
wasn't.
example.
Yeah. it was
That was
just
an example.
of what it could look like.
I mean, I think maybe by 2050.
I mean, you did see our new e-bike program though, didn't you?
Oh, man, we're knocking at the door.
All right, anybody else have questions, other questions?
Mr. Mayor,
I have a question.
well, Dwayne did ask a question that I think Shannon was prepared to answer. I don't know if,
Okay,
It's a quick answer.
well, let's start with the question. What was the question?
How can we implement climate action and have cost effectiveness?
Okay,
Is that your question?
Wasn't how I thought of the question.
Not increasing
Increasing
quality of life,
affordability.
Yeah,
increased
increasing
while
costs.
increasing the cost.
Yeah, how do you, how are we, increasing the quality of life by raising expenses that people have to pay?
So, as I said, our emissions are a drop in the global bucket, so like. Reducing our emissions is not the highest priority for us. When we're looking at specific climate actions like reducing VMT, we wanna weigh how much it's gonna cost with how much emissions are gonna save with how it's gonna increase equity. Like those three are all weighed relatively equally. So we're not gonna ask every citizen to go out and buy a Tesla. We're gonna implement programs like a tiered e-bike rebate program that helps lift up so that everybody has access to equitable climate actions.
So our eBay program is actually contributing to this, and we're not even thinking of it in that term.
Well, I worked on that grant.
That's actually-
Very-
that's why I started with
Yeah.
why are we doing it?
Anyways, other questions for Megan?
Yes,
I just
go ahead.
make a quick comment on the transportation. I mean, one of the things that I don't know how it affects it, but we can't get CNG buses for RTA anymore. They don't make them anymore. We're having to go back to diesel.
And yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's a problem.
Fascinating.
So I'm just telling you that we're thinking about drivers on
I
transportation.
can't stop thinking about that,
So-
going back to diesel buses.
And Megan said this, the where we kind of see like our transportation system up here is pretty good. Like we have pretty equitable access to public transit, e-bikes, etc. So transportation, and it's 2 square mile town, so our VMT within the town is pretty limited. So transportation isn't one of our big leverage points. Our big leverage points where we're producing the most emissions and we have the most, the highest potential to reduce emissions and increase quality of life potentially is in our existing commercial and residential buildings. Not new buildings, so not getting into building codes, but like existing infrastructure is 80% plus of our emissions. So that's where we want to start targeting programs. An example of that is green deed, like doing energy efficiency upgrades for deed restricted housing. Good for the people that live there, cheaper for the people that live there when their energy bills decrease, and also they're producing less emissions.
I had a question about, Megan, you put in your presentation, the mix between short-term rentals and deed restrictions. I think I know why that was in there, but maybe you could, before I throw it out there, you could tell me why it's in there.
Yeah, so originally I put in a statistic, it was like a vacancy rate from 2005, but it's pretty outdated, so we just thought that showing kind of the difference between how many short-term rentals are up here that are, being heated to 70 degrees when people aren't even there versus the number of deed restricted housing kind of shows that difference in why programs like Green Deed are important because it helps the people who are in those deed restricted houses and can also help in the short-term rentals.
Yeah. And so I get that the STRs are vacant, and we'll just call that the vacant house problem. I sure understand that, but I'm also curious, like, how you think it cuts from an energy usage. They're being heated with no one in them. but they're also not using water and wastewater and driving and all those other things. And so I'm curious how you think that cuts. Is that like win, lose or draw from a climate perspective? All of our short-term rentals is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, I think it's like, I don't know, I think of it as like, they're not using all this water and stuff, but they are still using that energy and people are traveling here. And so, like Shannon said, addressing the existing buildings and through energy efficiency or stuff like that will help address those problems as well, because they're using energy.
How would we benefit if they weren't traveling here? Or inversely, what happens if they're not traveling here? What do we end up with?
A big problem.
A smaller CO2 footprint, or sorry, was that for me?
Yeah.
That's what our tourists
Seems like we
don't
check
have.
every box. Is that what you're getting at?
No.
That's what your sales
But
tax
one
dollars
doesn't
go
agree.
down.
Oh,
Yeah.
that part. Go ahead.
So, and once again, I think that I'm speaking to the conundrum that we're dealing with, is that we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. So, what if, I'm just encouraging us to have an awareness of, what we're trying to accomplish and, from both sides. What's the negative impact as well as the positive? You can get myopic and look at just, greenhouse gases. But if you don't factor in all the other impacts of, like, say, people not coming here, will we even have a town? So I'm just saying this is way more complex.
And that's a fair point.
This is, we need to have something more than a superficial, observation of what's going on. We need to be looking at, a much bigger, have a much bigger awareness of various impacts.
I think the vacancies rate also just helps illustrate like what kinds of programs and policies we need to be working with based on. the composition
I
of
agree.
the town.
I agree.
Like
I already
we-
thought it too, just now.
We,
We got a new messaging program for property management companies. Sorry to interrupt.
oh, you're fine. We want climate actions, we can't take ones that are generalized for the state of Colorado or for Denver or something, because we have this very unique community.
I agree.
So we have to be very targeted with our climate actions.
Thank you for acknowledging my concern.
And you can also think of it in the sense that like the whole economy up here is based off of snow, off of how much snow we get out of the mountain. And even if our,
It's not just snow. We are summer. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Carl will tell you that winter dominates, I think.
Oh, yeah, it does. And I.
Yeah, or
You know, it's very important for the ski area.
yeah, and even other vulnerabilities, like I said, wildfire risk could very well impact the operations on CBMR. So having plans in place like resilience that aren't just policy based of we need to reduce this many emissions, but also putting in those safety nets for the community to help us bounce back or be able to react and respond to it when and if these disasters will happen.
Yeah, it's the if part of that that concerns me. Because what if it never has a problem? What if we really never have the problem, but we spend all this effort
Then all our
trying to
measures
solve a
work.
problem that we.
Then the efforts worked. 'Cause
Well,
it
Dwayne,
didn't
to be,
happen.
and to be fair too, we had this conversation with the codes, you can start factoring in variables. But sometimes it's also an infinite list of variables, and so you're never gonna get to
I know, and
this
that
is the number 100, but we're never, in either direction, we're never gonna get there. So I think we all have to be a little bit flexible with our, I mean, you sat through the codes discussion, like, and so you kind of try to take the variables that are the most important ones or the most impactful ones, but are there a million others? I was thinking about the empty house thing, same thing, they don't have kids in school. They're not using social services, they're not down at the hospital, and so there's all these things, that you could factor in, but it gets really difficult. As you factor in more variables, it gets more difficult to get to that, I think, that precise number or definitive answer that you.
Well,
create.
I'm just concerned that the message is that we're, headed off the cliff, so to speak. And, we have to do something. And so, number one, are we really heading off the cliff?
I would really like a point of actual
Let's
information.
have one conversation
Yeah,
here, please.
point of information, nothing in this report states that we're heading for a cliff.
No, I'm
Well, so let's
thinking
constrain, but
generically.
what we're here to talk about is this report. So let's focus on that.
One thing I thought was interesting. How much do you correlate, because we did see these massive number drops in 2020, 2021. So I see a lot of the correlations, I naturally connect them to COVID and the drop in travel here, second homeowners being here, that sort of stuff. Was that a consideration in putting these numbers together? I know it's probably a hard one to correlate.
Yeah, definitely, we did consider that, but we also looked at it was a warmer year in 2022, so we know that there was less energy for housing units. We can assume that COVID was still impacting the number of people coming here, but we can't say for sure, if COVID never happened, this would be the number, because we aren't sure about.
Gotcha.
Also, these inventories are for calendar year 2019, calendar year 2022. It's not making any statements about what happened in between.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so 2020
I was
globally,
seeing it as a spectrum. Okay.
2020 globally, there was a significant decrease in emissions from transportation, but when I was working for the city of Gunnison, we did a Gunnison County, city of Gunnison emissions inventory for 2020, and actually the emissions increased quite a bit locally, because we had more people here, we had more people in their homes, we had more
I was running my
Amazon, shipping.
Yeah.
So just that, there's definitely relationships between COVID and emission, but these, you can't draw the line between 2019 and 2022. We're just trying to
Gotcha.
get a sense of the change. And that 9% decrease is due to kind of those changes. I would say that is within almost the error bars. We can't say that we're increasing or that we're decreasing.
Awesome. Are we ever gonna see you again?
I might
Go on.
come scan some paperwork. We need that.
Well, thanks
Well,
for doing this.
Yeah, this was awesome. It's really great. I assume.
No. Well, Megan, so are there further questions about the methodology or the numbers or anything else that I included in the memo?
I would like to see us do a recommendation at some point.
Yeah. So kind of the next
That
step,
needs to be something realistic.
yes. So the 50% recommendation is kind of a climate action. It's like a recommendation from the state, from the federal government. It's that 50% reduction by 2030 from a 2015 baseline for all jurisdictions and have a 2014 baseline. So first step is kind of setting that trajectory of where we want to be by 2030 or 2035. And then we kind of work backwards, and there's a really common emissions graph that you can see where it's like a stacked line chart that shows your emissions from this year to this year from energy and transportation and wastewater treatment, solid waste. And so we want to look at starting backwards from 2030, where we have the most leverage points to reduce our emissions in each of those sectors. So we start with our 2022 baseline, we start with a 2030 goal, and we do the forecasting in between. We can figure out where we think we can make the most impact and where we have the best leverage points and where is most equitable for our community. And then in 2 to 3 years, we do another emissions inventory to double check if our policies are actually working. If e-bike program, for example, is actually reducing VMT we'll be able to check that in a couple of years.
And to think we're gonna meet all these goals based on the 2015 building codes is pretty impressive. That's, you gotta get this.
Oh, yeah. So the 2019 data was an inventory that got started by Janet and Leah in 2019. And then, well, it got started in early 2020 because the way these inventories work, you have to wait for the utility to get all their data from last year. So it got started in like January, February of 2020, and then something happened that sidelined the emissions inventory in like 2020. So we found all that, yeah. We found-
You're not smelling what you put down there.
So we have all that data on the record. And then one other thing to that point is that the waste data that shows like a 25% decrease. And we know that the waste data for 2022 is actually very accurate for what was produced, what Waste Management picked up in the boundary for 2022. And in 2019, it was like pretty extrapolated. So that 23% decrease in waste emissions is probably the 2022 numbers are more accurate. We probably didn't have that much of a jump. We just didn't have as accurate of reporting in 2019.
But the methodologies are the same.
Yes, but just what Waste Management gave us was, what they gave Leah and Janet was like all of Gunnison County, and so we did it proportionally, versus this round, they actually got us the specific Mount CB data. So.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, James
Thanks.
started to charge on this.
And thank you, Megan, for your work. Yeah, much appreciated.
Super awesome.
All right, we got 8 minutes or something